Once any species breaks the cradle of their own home planet and starts to expand throughout the universe, they have always come across one area of space that is considered far too dangerous for them to traverse. This area is covered with things like black holes and magnetic fields that are so powerful that they would rip most ships apart or make most equipment unusable at that point, as the sudden abundance of CMEs or solar flares would damage all their equipment. So, as each species reaches out, they have all considered this area the dead zone. It didn't matter what type of language they used, what type of dialect, it all came out to the same thing. You enter this area and you are done. Nothing could survive in there. Even the closest planets to the border are considered Class 12 death worlds, as their tectonic activity alone would make it impossible for any of the species to survive. This is not even to account for sudden changes of weather that would make any species inviable within a single solar rotation. So it was to everyone's surprise when something came out of the dead zone. It started light at first, small little tick tick ticks across the magnetic spectrum, originally dismissed as atmospheric bounce or universal background noise. However, it was soon followed several years later by things that were almost coherent. It was almost like language. What could this be? But it was almost always different. There was a similar dialect used across each one, but they could not understand. And this was one of the few things that started to draw species together, is their wonder about the dead zone. Several ships have been sent into the dead zone, but none have returned, each of them claiming that they have found a planet that possibly could hold life, but quickly after entering the atmosphere, they lose any and all communication. Since instantaneous transmission is quite literally impossible over those distances, it usually would be several solar rotations before they would find out what happened to the ship, that it was lost, or if it had actually recovered from whatever traumatic experience. But still, transmissions leaked out, not in their own language. And to this day, it is considered almost myth and legend that there's a blue planet somewhere deep in the dead zone, somewhere where life can actually survive, someplace horrors can come from, because only horrors could come from the dead zone. Nothing should be able to survive there, and everyone wonders what could possibly survive, and if it does survive, what could possibly come from the dead zone. Every sentient species knows to stay out of the dead zone. It's far too dangerous, and the solar activity alone would be enough to roast most ships. The only ones that have ever been crazy enough or brave enough to try were outfitted with some of the most expensive shielding we could create. And even then, we didn't find much out from them. They would end up sending a few transmissions back that we couldn't quite make sense of. A few conflicting reports, and then a few things that matched up. Something about a blue speck in the night. But that was all we got. Eventually, the communications would just stop. So everyone stayed out. So it was to everyone's horror when a transmission came from the dead zone. Hello, is anyone out there? A simple phrase. It took our computers several solar rotations to actually decipher it. But eventually we could respond. Yes, we are here. To our absolute surprise, within a couple of months, we would end up sending transmissions back and forth. We couldn't quite get our own video to go through, but they would send us scattered images along with their own audio. As we come to find out, their species was called human, and they have always lived in the dead zone. They don't know anything different. We offered them a place in galactic society, which they were more than happy to accept. However, we told them that to do so, they must pay to enter, which is what we expect of all new sentient species, to pay for the honor of being one of us, to have a seat at the table. They may not have a commanding seat at the table, but they would still have a seat there as long as they were still willing to give us technology and resources. This was met with silence from the dead zone. We did not understand what the silence was about. We kept trying to contact them over and over again. Eventually, we tried to send several ships in. Of course, these ships were very well armored and needed to be fairly well armed because the amount of debris that flies around the dead zone, you must be willing to defend yourself. It was over an entire solar cycle, as the humans would put it, several years before we finally got a response. The response was simple yet confusing to us. It was, "We don't negotiate with terrorists." Now, this last word is not something that translates well. We did not understand what they meant. How could they turn down such an offer that we would allow them to be part of us, to trade with us, and all they would have to do is give us several of their planets, at least one or two every decade or so, just to as payment, as dues to be part of our galactic union? What would be so terrible with that? It is what all the young species must do, and eventually they will all fall under our banner. It is what has been done. We don't understand. So we sent a large group of some of our best ships from all of our species to the edge of the dead zone. And with the strongest communication equipment that we could develop, we sent them a message. The message was, "Lower your weapons and prepare to pay tribute." As we were about to enter the dead zone, we had our final reply from the humans. It was in two of their different languages, which we had to translate. The first one was Malan Labe, which we still have not translated. And the second part was, "Bring it on, bitch." Flying into the dead zone, we all had our trepidations about it since none of our previous ships had returned. However, the previous ships only went single and did not have the sensor arrays that we had now. As we pierced the outer edge of the dead zone, we realized that the dead zone itself was almost like a barrier, a shield, as you were. As once we got through, our sensors could pick up several planets in the distance, one of which was actually inhabited. This shocked us, but was not a total surprise, as we knew the dead zone itself was inhabited by these impudent little bipeds that dare challenge us. We headed straight to that planet and got ready to take it. We came in very close and saw that many of their ships were actually trying to leave the planet. We lined up our cannons and fired into them with our energy weapons. Many of their ships simply melted or split in half. Others ended up being damaged and had to crash land on their planet. This brought us a sense of joy as we realized they could not stand against us. Reading only approximately 3 million left on the planet, we decided to land our own forces. The transport ships went down and disembarked just outside of their major city. It was a surprise to hear that it was a very large agricultural area just outside the city. This brought us much delight, as we knew the agricultural planets made excellent tributes, and we would take this planet as their very first tribute to ours, our greatness. And suddenly we found that those bipeds were not as helpless as we thought. Suddenly, many cracks of sound entered the atmosphere, and many of our soldiers began to drop. Something flew at us at something around the speed of sound and would smack into our soldiers as they ran for cover. We didn't know what it was, but our soldiers then charged towards the city. Any of these bipeds they immediately fired their plasma based weapons into, and each of these bipeds that was hit would scream out in pain, but it would take more than one hit to take them down. Seeing the first strike, even if it was directly in the center of these bipeds, it would burn them. The smell was abhorrent, and that biped, this human, would scream in pain for a moment and then raise its weapon up again. We found that they were some sort of primitive projectile weapons. Primitive as they may be, they still worked. Many of their projectiles began to pierce through even our chitinous allies as they began to fall one by one. This enraged us. How dare they fight against us? The order came down to take them all apart, even if it's hand-to-hand combat. As our own people entered the city, these bipeds, those that were not armed, would jump at our people and grab them, and to our absolute shock, something that barely stood 60% of our height was able to grab one of ours, lift it out of the ground or off the ground with one hand, reach with its other arm, and rip an appendage clean off our soldiers. And then, laughing, it would use that appendage to beat the same one of our warriors to death. It was absolutely stunning. But this fear brought much anger with it, as our soldiers began to blast out at anything that moved. It didn't matter if it was half formed, if it was a larvae, we didn't care. They all will die today. To our absolute shock, we thought we had knocked the fight out of them after the first 48 hours. Then one of our groups came across an area. The sign said Elementary Skao. Inside, many of their larvae were holed up, protected by a few of their females. They were hiding in the basement area, and our soldiers decided to show the humans, this is what happens when you go against us, when you defy us. They sent out the signal to show all their larvae, all their females being blasted 5, 6, 7, a dozen times, screaming in agony and pain as their internal organs began to cook inside their bodies, and eventually they broke. Taking this planet was difficult. Surprisingly, with only 3 million inhabitants, we wager only about maybe 500,000 actually fought. But our losses were surprisingly high. Approximately 8% of the entire invading force was completely lost. Another 16% were damaged. However, with a little bit of healing time, they would be back. As we consolidated our forces and began to take stock of what the planet had to offer us, we sent the message along with a video of us taking out their larvae. This is what happens when you defy us. Surrender, or this will be the fate of your entire race. It took less than a solar rotation for them to respond. Their message was confusing at most, as we did not understand why they said that we had mated toward the sky. We played it back, and it simply said, "Now we're really gonna fuck you up." After taking the planet, we consolidated our forces and started to look closer at the resistance we had. Mainly, we had to take the bodies, cut them apart, and see exactly what we're working against. In this case, we were surprised to find that the endoskeleton that they used is incredibly dense, incredibly hard, and surprisingly flexible. The musculature is far denser than we expected, which is the reason why they seem to be so strong. Which is strange considering the gravity on this planet is no different than ours. As we continued along, we realized that they didn't have a lot of weapons. It's amazing how they can be so defiant when they can't even fight this small little group that we have. Strange, but at least we know it's better to shoot them from outside their atmosphere than to actually take them on the ground. They are quite dangerous up close. We are now modifying our weapons so that they fire a more condensed blast. We have been checking them against the human cadavers, and it seems that we will be able to actually disable them, if not straight up kill them with one shot. However, the weapons will overheat after approximately 3 shots. If we fire them in quick succession, they'll immediately have to open and vent. Our plasma energy weapons are just unable to disperse that much heat that fast. However, with this new upgrade, we shouldn't be taking any more losses like we did before. It was approximately 4 days before we were ready to move on to the next planet. We set up for one just outside of a gas giant. It wasn't much of a planet, it was actually a moon, a satellite, if you will, and it seemed to be heavy in vegetation. We knew this would be difficult for our normal ground forces, so we went to one of our associates. I'll be nice and call them that. They paid tribute and now they fall under our banner, but they are more apt for this type of terrain, as they can move much faster. Their sense of smell and hearing is far better than ours. However, their intelligence level is not quite as high as we would have liked. Reaching our forces to their satellite, we found a few of their actual warships. This actually confirmed our suspicions that the ones we took down before were simple freighters, frigates, and transports. These other ships surprised us a bit, as they were outnumbered almost 50 to 1. They charged our lines to get within range, and we didn't realize that they had no actual range. As we began to charge up our cannons, we could see that they were launching something. We couldn't figure out what until several of our ships were pierced, stem to stern, by huge chunks of metal. This surprised us as we turned our guns on them. They began to take evasive maneuvers, trying to stay out of range of our ships. However, this was a losing battle, as if they moved too much, they would give us a straight line to the planet. And clearly, they were not willing to do that. This allowed us to put several of our shots into the side of their ships, and shocking all of us, they didn't come apart. Not like the previous ships did. Large scorch marks would end up on the side of their ships. They would simply roll to the other side and continue to fire. This again confused us because it didn't seem like they needed to face their ship in any particular direction in order to fire. This was odd. Our weapons are fixed because they take up a good portion of the keel of our ships, and yet they had these rotating pieces on their ships that seemed to fire these projectiles constantly. Our larger ships were taking hits left and right, and yet we still were able to get close enough to engage them with our main guns. Once we were able to corral them close enough together, we began to fire in volleys. As strong as those ships were, they were not strong enough to face our big guns. Our main guns did exactly what they were supposed to do. Though it took a condensed amount of fire, as in several ships firing at once, we could still take out one of their ships before they did too much damage to our fleet. Each one, if it could, did an emergency landing on the planet. Others evacuated their ship as we saw pods flying out the side and heading directly to their planet. Once they did, we realized that the ships were not safe to capture, as they would immediately lose their ability to stay in any type of orbit and plummet towards the satellite below, each of them burning as they went through the atmosphere. So be it. Now we knew what these humans could bring. We weren't quite impressed. However, we still had to take this satellite. It would be their second tribute to us and our glory. We sent our ships down and immediately released our canine-ish cohorts as they began sniffing around, trying to seek out their quarry. They didn't get far before those horrific sounds began. Bang, 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 bang. Off in the distance, and then the bullets, as they call them, those pieces of metal began to rip through those that we sent down to the surface, and then explosives came down from the sky. What was going on? Every species fights with its own personal defenses and offensive weapons that it was born with, and then it had our own energy weapons with it. Aside from that, they didn't fight with multiple different weapons. How were they able to handle this? We looked at them. They were very simple. 2 arms, 2 legs, several small appendages at the ends of each. How were they able to handle all these different things? Eventually, we simply had to draw up our transport ships after losing over 50% of our initial ground invasion force. And that's when we decided if they would make it too difficult on the ground, we could still beat them up here. We targeted their main cities, their biggest structures, with our primary weapons. We fried the entire planet. Where once cities stood were nothing but glass-covered craters. Where small towns were nothing but small marks on the ground. At least 20% of the planet was on fire. As we expected, they would simply call and surrender themselves to us, surrender humanity, and finally pay the tribute, and we would charge them. We would tell them that they owe us 10 times the tribute, or we would destroy them. They would make good slaves, after all, being so strong, even though being of small stature. We all smiled and reveled at the idea of having one of these humans as our pet. Hold onto it by its collar and command it to protect us, to hurt those that we wanted to. But of course, we'd need them alive for that. We continued to wait for a transmission from the surface. When nothing came, we simply got ready to send our resource gatherers down to the surface. And that's when we saw it. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. What in the 7 hells is that? There was a strange moment of confusion as they looked upon this massive ship that had come with barely a dozen of its own support craft. They were confused. Was this the humans that they had heard so much about? Could they possibly actually have a flagship this large? It wouldn't matter. Their energy weapons would burn through the hull just like they burned through the others. Then they received a single communication from the enemy ship. Two words: leave now. Laughing at this, the aliens took up position and began to get into striking range, or at least attempt to, so that their main batteries would have the ability to cut through the human armor. As they did this, several smaller ships from the human battle group had broken off and headed towards the planet. As they did, some of the aliens were confused. Were they driving their ships over just to abandon ships? They're launching life pods. And then some other smaller ships actually burst out from them as well. As they looked through, the alien commander saw that the closest one of these smaller ships had a strange marking on it. And then he looked, so did the other one that was flying near it. It was a strange red mark with a vertical red line and a horizontal red line intersecting in the center. Without another moment's hesitation, the order was given to shoot these ships and use that symbol as a target so that they could maximize efficiency. Turning their ships, the aliens fired their energy weapons into the hull and watched part of the hull disintegrate as it melted away. The force of the atmosphere pushing up against the ships did the rest as they began to plummet to the surface, and then even more pods shot out. This was one of the last things that those aliens ever saw. As they cheered, the human fleet suddenly flashed several lights at them, and they only had a moment to consider what was happening as a whole bunch of projectiles, some numbering in the hundreds of thousands, started piercing the hulls of their ships, going straight past their energy shields. How is this possible? Suddenly, 20, 30 ships were split in half or cut stem to stern by these projectiles. The alien battle group turned towards the massive human ship and began to engage with its energy weapons. To their absolute shock, the energy weapons could not penetrate the hull like they could with the other ships. It only took a moment, 1 or 2 galactic seconds, before their energy weapons were able to cut through the smaller ships. But this one was another one altogether. It began to rise from its position as it had jumped in around the southern pole, and the alien ships were around the planet's equator. As it moved up, it began to move its larger guns, and the aliens shuddered at the size of what they saw. A massive energy blast, a blue stream of light came out from the dorsal side as it cut through the enemy fleet in one large swath. Any ship in its way was cut apart by this massively dense beam of particles as it made its way through. This made the formation on the alien side break, and they began to shoot wildly into the humans' battle group. Another volley of the projectiles came through and began to tear it to pieces. Then other alien ships ran towards the surface, given orders to retrieve their people and leave this planet as soon as they could. They weren't given much of a chance. As they began to go down, they suffered the same fate as the ships that had the red marking. The humans fired on them, more often than not catching them in the engine, and watched as it tumbled. The crew desperately trying to reach the life pods as the ship tumbled relentlessly through the atmosphere. The alien ships, still in orbit, continued to fire, tried to hold the line as they sent out some sort of recovery crew to try to grab their people. The humans were relentless. Behind these projectiles, they didn't notice, but several other long shafts of metal being propelled by some sort of chemical reaction were flying towards them. They only hoped that their hull could handle the impact. They were wrong. With every single one of these strikes, the front of the alien ship was blown asunder, like the front of an exploding muzzle that had been clogged. And then the ship was dead in space, and so was its crew. The aliens began to back up, trying to get away from the planet as they heard the messages from down on the surface. What that had been launched to the surface was not escape pods. They had released some sort of bipedal metal monster as it came through with a gigantic projectile weapon and began to blast through what was left of the Xeno forces. Every single one of its shot would take an arm, a leg, a head, or just blow the body into small chunks if there was anything to survive. Anyone that tried to take it hand to hand was just shoved aside, and the huge hand would reach up, grab the Xeno, and crush it in its wake. It was a complete horror show on the planet. As more and more of these monstrosities arrived, humans also seemed to come out of nowhere, coming out of holes in the ground that they hid into to protect themselves from alien fire. They came up with a vengeance and offered no quarter, no sanctuary. Anyone that gave up was grabbed off the ground and ripped apart with the humans' bare hands. The sparse video that came up from the surface, was enough to give any Xeno nightmares forever. They realized that there was no returning anyone from the surface, and the order was given to run. They had to run if they wanted to survive. They turned towards their escape route and turned their engines on as fast as possible, trying to get as far away so that they could escape the gravity field to make their jump. And they did. Approximately 38% of the initial force had arrived at its destination. The rest were left behind as either smoldering wrecks or target practice for the human ships as they closed the distance. The commanders began to call each other to figure out what to do next, what they should do, and to their absolute shock, the humans jumped in not far from them and began to fire again. As soon as they could, the aliens began to jump, their engines beginning to overheat from jumping in quick succession the way they did. The FTL they had could not handle successive jumps. 2, 3, 4 jumps. The humans were on their tail, and it was up to the commanding general to send a single message. We have engaged the human fleet. We've shot down several of their ships, but they just keep coming. They are relentless. They are pursuing us to the limit of our engines. They will not hold out for more than 2 more jumps. If you receive this, know that they are coming with a ship that must be destroyed immediately. If it is allowed to leave the dead zone, then we are all doomed. Everyone must mobilize. Get your militaries ready. Every ship, every citizen, get them ready, because if you don't... The message was received approximately 3 planetary rotations later. Every leader that saw the video, saw the battle, pretty much had the same look on their face as they looked at each other. Oh, shit. Approximately 3 weeks ago, the humans found out that their supposed new friends were now true enemies, and decided they needed to mobilize the fleet. However, this would take time to gather all the battle groups together as a unified front to fight whatever might be coming through towards their dead zone / human space. It was not that long before they found out that the enemy had decided they would make a preemptive strike. One of the outer colonies, a brand new colony that had only been formed less than 4 months prior, had been attacked and essentially been wiped clean. Any remnants there would have to be found and saved. At that point, at least one of the battle groups, the 14th battle group, was almost completely composed and on its way back to link up with the main fleet when they found a second colony was under attack. The patrol ships, their only defense, as the colony was only approximately 2 years old, only had a few patrol ships to protect it, and they blast out a mayday as soon as the enemy fleet arrived. They sent out as much information as possible, but they knew, everyone knew, it was going to be a losing battle. But we're humans. We take out as many of them as we can. And eventually the patrol ships were left to either crash on the planet or burn up in atmosphere. The video that came back from the aliens as a warning that they told us we should surrender to them or we would face the fate. Well, you don't say that while killing a room full of women and children, you son of a bitch. The anger within the 14th battle group was palpable, and immediately they changed course. The commander immediately told everybody to go to general quarters, as they would engage the enemy as soon as they could jump in. Unfortunately, it would be several hours before they could get there. As good as the tech was, it still had its limits. Upon jumping in, the fleet came out just around the planet's southern pole. This was normal for human technology because going in where the poles are makes it easy for the jump engines to actually make it within the planet's orbit. Anywhere else in the gravity field is just too strong and will pull any large ship directly out of space and directly towards the gravity field that the planet is creating. Just as they came out, they realized the enemy was there. However, the enemy wasn't firing. A quick scan of the surrounding area, the planet's surface, came out that there was no human ships left in orbit, and some of the cities had been completely annihilated. Nothing left. However, possible life signs were found. Hearing this, the order was given that they immediately needed to get their recovery vessels / medical ships along with several corvettes over to the planet. Immediately, the corvettes started dropping their drop pods with soldiers inside, and the medical ships broke free as well, trying to make to the closest pockets of human settlements as possible. They, however, did not make it. Though they were clearly marked with the red cross, the aliens turned their guns and fired on those ships. Not only did every medical ship get sunk, i.e., sent down to the planet in a hunk of flaming metal, but at least one of the corvettes was not able to break free in time and was forced to abandon ship, launching its pods toward the surface. The humans might have been mad before, but now they were royally pissed. The commanders barely had time to give the order, all guns, fire at will, before every single turret traversed and began launching every type of weapon they had. First, it was railgun rounds, and right beside that, torpedoes were fired. Obviously, the railguns are a hell of a lot faster than torpedoes, but it didn't matter. They were going to bring hell upon these fucking Xenos. The commander of the flagship of the battle group, the Golden Dragon, was ordered to traverse and bring up the main gun. This main gun was a gigantic particle laser, and it would fire a energy blast for approximately 41 seconds before having to be shut down, simply due to heat and nothing else. It was used exactly the way it was designed, turned on and strafed right across the entire enemy's battle line. Anything within 1.2 million kilometers was sliced clean in half by that beam. Even if it was just touched, it would flicker any shielding they had and immediately start melting the armor clean off. Behind that was again all the weapons heading their way, and it wasn't long before they could see recovery craft attempting to make their way to the surface. But humans, they were done with these aliens. A simple order was sent down to the forces on the ground. 3 words that they have heard before: kill them all. With this, the surface of the planet became a complete hellscape for any type of alien that showed up. They grabbed them by the neck and snapped them. A few of the soldiers, the Terran drop soldiers, would pick up the Xenos and actually rip them in half with their power armor. Anyone on the ground who was still alive came out of their holes they were hiding in, grabbed any weapon they could, and started beating wholesale Xeno ass. Up above, that's when the ships realized they were totally screwed and tried to run. They got far enough away from the gravity well as the humans tried to give chase. They locked on what direction the Xenos were jumping and watched as they blinked out. Everyone stopped for a moment and waited for the commander to give any type of order. Were they going to wait? The sheer rage in his eyes should have been enough. But he gave another order. Follow them! And the main ship, the Golden Dragon, headed straight out of the gravity well to try and chase the Xenos down. And jump after jump, they would show up, and the Xenos would be just out of effective weapons range for the railguns, since they would be able to dodge the railgun rounds now that they knew what they were facing. They would also be able to jump before the torpedoes were able to reach them. This didn't stop the humans from firing, but they would just have to chase them more and more. We are persistence hunters, after all, he said, as they jumped again and again. Even as their own jump engines began to overheat, it didn't matter. When humans want blood, they're going to get it. They could see that the alien vessels were starting to overheat. Hell, half of them had started to glow, and others had actually exploded from trying to get away. They caught that message that the Xenos sent. It put a smile on everyone's face as they realized the Xeno fleet couldn't jump anymore. They realized this as the largest ships from the Xeno fleet were simply floating in space, the engines seemingly going dead as they couldn't push any harder. The humans increased their speed as they received that final message, a plea for help and a warning to their own kin. As fate would have it, the Xenos ended up at the same planet they had glassed and cleared of humankind. Seeing this, the last of the human battle group gave no quarter, gave no mercy, and gave him a good old human fuck you as they blasted every single Xenoship apart. With the last one just a hulk in space, the engines were allowed to cool down, which would take several days as hard as they pushed them. But every single human breathed a sigh of relief and prayed for those who were lost. It would be a long time before they were able to get going again. The commander of the battle group tried to send as many ships back to help with recovery operations at all possible, but all the ships that had jumped were reaching their limit and either had to cool down or risk exploding on the way back. They didn't like waiting. But at least as they watched the burning hulks of the Xeno fleet burn into the atmosphere of the colony they first destroyed, they could take a little bit of solace knowing that they had sent a message, and the message was simple: get off my lawn. After the battle, neither side had any illusions on what was going to happen next. The Galactic Union knew that they had just kicked the hornet's nest and knew that the humans from the dead zone were going to be coming for them, and they had to prepare. They summoned every ship that was capable of fighting from every single species in the Union. It didn't matter if they gave their intrepidations or did not want to fight an enemy that had so thoroughly destroyed the invasion group. It did not matter. The Galactic Union and its leaders demanded that each ship capable of fighting will show up, and they were given a timeline which roughly comes out to 6 months in human terms. They were given coordinates to meet up, to link together, to rally, so that they could stop the humans when they show up. There was no if anymore. They saw from the message that there was absolutely no stopping the humans once they locked on their target, and the Galactic Council members, the hierarchs, did not want to be the ones in the way. However many bodies, however many ships they had to throw in the face of the humans, they would do it. And they would do it with as much as possible, as many ships, as many souls as it took to protect them. That's how many they would throw. Doing the calculations, it wouldn't take long before the number of ships rallied was well over 100,000, with another 50 plus thousand on the way. This included all their support units, all their battleships, everything down to the smallest patrol boat, even the transports that were Q ships were required to show up. There was no question on this, or else the hierarchs would have sent their own fleet to the systems to take them by force. This is how the Galactic Council handled the pending invasion. The humans, on the other side, were more concerned with recovery because the damage that was taken had decimated two entire colonies. One planet was almost uninhabitable due to the glassing that it had received. However, its citizens did not want to ever leave. You could say that was good old-fashioned human stubbornness. However, it wasn't stubbornness that brought all the different fleets together. What the Xenos didn't know is that as humanity had taken to the stars, different groups of people from different parts of Earth had taken different parts of different sectors and different planets. In some cases, different societies lived on the same planet, basically splitting it in two, but providing with each other, trading with each other, and trading with others. The more personnel they had, the faster the colony will grow, of course. There were, of course, a few issues, as some decided to expand well beyond their own borders. However, each of these planets that had a population worth defending or willing to defend itself would build its own ships. They started simply with the patrol boats that the alien forces had first originally met. Small, light, but heavily armored and very fast ships. You can consider them close to the old American PT, as in patrol torpedo boats. Well armed, and a hell of a pain in the ass to anyone who comes against them. However, they could not take the direct hit from the alien firearms. The main cannons on those ships were more than enough to melt through the hull of the patrol boats. After that, they moved up to frigates, then to destroyers, then to battleships, dreadnoughts, and carriers. However, carriers were exceptionally rare, as there was only two true carriers built, both of which were controlled by Earth Force itself. Reason being is that the idea of a fighter in space is laughable. The amount of G-forces you would need to actually dodge any type of incoming fire would be more than the human squishy body can take. Everything was done via drones at that point, since they didn't have any squishy bodies to squish. That being said, Earth was more than willing to send them. The 14th Battle Group was part of the Earth Centralized Forces. These centralized forces were, of course, around the main planets of Earth, Alpha Centauri, Proxima 3, and all those. And they were simply out to dissuade anyone else from causing major damage. If there was a regional conflict, they sat and watched, just made sure that the conflict did not go beyond its borders. Then and only then would they step in. It would be the right of conquest of the winner, of course. However, it was not a good idea to stretch a battle far beyond a single planet, or a single galaxy in one case. I mean, they are humans after all, they're going to fight. That being said, seeing the colony, even not of their own kin, be destroyed, being wiped off the map, the first one being taken as these monsters would come in with weapons that were more designed to injure than kill, and would take several hits before they were actually lethal. Then they decided to go into an elementary school and not only kill the teachers, but kill the students in the same brutal fashion. And when the 14th Battle Group decided to go and send medical ships to assist, they actually shot down medical ships on the way. This sent the entirety of humanity into a bloodlust that no one had seen since the great old days before firearms, when bloodlust was common, and the Galactic Union had brought it back. From small colonies came patrol ships, from large colonies came battle groups, and the entire Earth centralized fleet, with the exception of the second battle group, which would remain behind as a defense posture, were all sent towards the front. Every single one of them began to rally and draw up battle plans. This would be the first time in several hundred years that these forces had come together. Now, on opposite sides of the void, two massive fleets armed themselves. One, outside the void, is gathering those even unwilling to fight, get every single one of their ships that is capable of fighting is brought to the front. Inside the void, not only were ships designed to fight being brought, but even those who could retrofit their transport ships with just a few torpedo launchers or even simple point defense cannons were showing up, loaded with supplies, ready to assist. It was glorious. A sight to see as each one of these ships showed up and checked in with each of the Central Command's battle groups. Sent to one of the battle groups to be under their command, they did not hesitate. They did not question. They knew that if the Galactic Union actually did invade the void, or what the Galactic Union calls the void, then they would be in such deep shit they didn't even want to think about it. Many of these colonies knew that it was just as big a chance that they would have been the ones attacked, and they did not want that to happen. Every human that could fight was ready to fight. Railguns were checked. Torpedo tubes were loaded. Ships were refit and sent up. Even some ships, though it took days to do so, were stripped down to their basic hull and then rebuilt from the inside out so that they could actually fight. It only took about the same time to get everything ready. 7 months. 7 months, and the human probes could see that the Galactic Union's probes were coming in, checking on them. They both knew where each other were. However, the probe would have to go inside the void or outside, and then traverse back to send its readings. This became an odd dance as probes were popped in and out, jumped in with just enough power to jump out within about 10 seconds of jumping in, just enough to get a sensor reading. Each ship would actually play a game to see who could actually shoot it first. It didn't matter what side the probe had showed up on. All that really mattered was that they both knew the battle was coming. The only question that was on anyone's mind on either side of the void was which side would jump in first. If the Galactic Union actually truly knew anything about humanity, they would have known this one simple truth. Never give humans a chance to prepare for war. For we may care so much for our brethren, but that care comes with the opposite, which is rage. And now that rage has reached a fever pitch, and everyone wants blood. and they will have it, as the signal was sent out across the fleet in a phrase everyone knew as the signal to start the invasion. Cry havoc and let slip the dogs of war. The Galactic Union saw the human ships begin to move towards the edge of the dead zone. They had 3.5 minutes before the human ships breached the edge of the dead zone and their weapons could lock onto their position. They knew exactly where the humans were going to come out, and they figured that as soon as they crossed the dead zone, they could open up with their main cannons and take out that massive ship at the center of the battle group. What they didn't know is the humans had a little bit of a surprise for them. Less than 30 seconds behind that first battle group, the rest of the battle groups came in at light speed and then went full burn at sublight speed to try and catch up with the first battle group. However, they had to get into combat speed as fast as they could, or else they would be cut apart piecemeal. As the human forces breached the line, that is when the Galactic Union ships charged up their weapons and began to fire into the human ships. Without hesitation, the human ship turrets raised, aimed, and fired their ordnance as fast as they could, and the sky began to burn with the amount of energy weapons flying in and the amount of projectiles flying out. Every torpedo tube, every missile tube, every gun was firing. The Galactic Union believed that they had the advantage and believed that this would be a quick fight. However, as they began to see damage on the first main ship and several of their support ships had already begun venting atmosphere and tried to break away, to their absolute horror, over 10 more of these main battleships made their way in. It was a complete shock. However, it did not stop the Galactic Union from firing. If anything, they began to run their weapons hot in a desperate attempt to try and knock the enemy forces back. Retreating slightly as they fired, they realized that the human ships were getting close. So close, in fact, by galactic terms, it can be considered a knife fight. As each of the ship began to breach the dead zone, more and more ordnance began to fly out towards the Galactic Union ships. The Galactic Union ships began to traverse themselves sideways to get more guns to bear as their main bow-mounted batteries began to overheat. Going for a full broadside, they tried to fire at the human ships as the human ships continued to advance as fast as they could, trying to breach the line of the Galactic Union ships. As though a bubble was expanding, the Galactic Union ships spread out further and further to make sure the human ships did not get in their lines. They feared, if nothing else, if the main cannons were as strong as what they saw, a full broadside from human ships would be beyond devastating. However, they were not expecting the humans to have any more of those energy weapons. As the rest of the large dreadnoughts came into play, they began to charge up their main guns. This huge particle laser was designed for one purpose and one purpose only: to split planets. However, it will do very well against Galactic Union ships, with each one as they came out spread hundreds of thousands of kilometers wide from each other in almost a spiderweb formation. They came in at odd angles. It wasn't long before the Galactic Union ships realized what was happening, as they could sense the large charge of energy through their sensors, and before they could move, huge swaths of blue lasers began to whip across the entire battle zone, ripping apart any ship in its wake. The humans were not unscathed in this, as they ended up ending their laser fire and continued on with projectile cannons. Many of their small ships were damaged in trying to retreat, venting atmosphere. Some had been shredded, others melted, as you could see the humans vented into the atmosphere. However, the Galactic Union ships weren't doing any better themselves. Even though the humans were at this point outnumbered, probably 200 to 1, it did not matter. They were going to give them a good old human fuck you, as they ordered all their ships into full speed ahead, and each one burst into the enemy lines. The point defense cannons were now in play, running hot as they blew hundreds of trillions of rounds of tungsten metal into the enemy ships. Though they would bounce off the energy shields only slightly after 4 or 5 rounds, they would begin to go through. The energy shields were not designed for projectiles, they were designed for energy weapons. And that's all. Outside the dead zone, there's almost no space debris. The void is quite literally that, the void. There's nothing out there. So they didn't have to worry about large hulls. They didn't have to worry about thermal bursts that would melt through their hulls. They didn't have to worry about the absolute horror show that is space inside the dead zone. So their ships began to get ripped apart like paper. The battle, even only lasting about 5 minutes, the humans began to rip into the formation deep enough that many ships began to turn and run. To their absolute horror, some of the main dreadnought ships of the Galactic Union actually fired on those attempting to flee. However, with their main guns pointed at the human fleet, most of the shots went wild, or were just not powerful enough to damage the ships as they were out of range. With the enemy lines beginning to break, the destroyers ran towards the line. They charged the guns with reckless abandonment. The turrets began to traverse up, down, left, right, even though there is no up or down in space. The pitch and yaw of the ships as they dodged fire were absolutely sporadic. Anything smaller than a destroyer began to go through the enemy fleet, going around them like you would see a motorcycle go around cars, but in this case, it was three-dimensional fighting. Drifting while firing was commonplace. They would even wait until they were at quite literal point-blank range for the enemy ships before they fired their dorsal-mounted railguns, as Q ships even joined the fight as they fired at what they could into the enemy fleet. The comm system was absolutely flooded with all sorts of reports of ships being hit, ships being disabled, and even enemy ships begging the humans for mercy. This call did not fall on deaf ears as a message went out in Galactic Standard. This is Admiral Pop of the human fleet. If you are willing to stand down, we will spare your lives. Power down your weapons and your engines, and we will consider you non-hostile, and you will survive. I say again, power down weapons and engines, and we will consider you non-hostile. Failure to do so, and you will be destroyed today. It did not take more than a few seconds before some ships began to stop firing and shut their weapons off and let themselves go adrift. To some of the Galactic Union, this was akin to being a traitor, and they were fired upon by their own ships. These zealots were immediately targeted, as every ship captain gave the order for their gunners to target any of the enemy ships that fire on their own. This day, humans will get more than their pound of flesh. They will get their bellies full for centuries to come. But as it is said before, there's no reason we can't be civil about this, is there? It was another 30 minutes of energy blasts going through armor, projectiles piercing and splitting ships, torpedoes ripping into a hull and blasting huge holes in them, and missiles moving this way and that as they went onto smaller targets. Even the carrier finally arrived and the drones were released. These drones went into the enemy fleet and strafed everything that was there. Anything that was not marked as surrendered, it went in and began tear asunder. This was one of the few areas that they realized that the Galactic Union had actually prepared for, as they did have point defense systems that tore the drones up fairly well. Even with the drones being torn up, that was more than enough to shut down the last of the enemy shields, and the largest enemy ship would go silent. Humans at that time broadcast again. This is Admiral Pop of the human fleet. Stand down. I say again, stand down. The battle is lost and there is no reason for you to surrender your lives this day. It did not take long before the Galactic Union fleet, what was left of it, left in tatters, was sending out message begging for help as their ships were venting radiation into their crew compartments. Anything would help them. They would give anything, even if it meant becoming slaves as they knew it. Since that is the way the Galactic Council does things, they simply assumed that is the way humans would take care of things. They were wrong. For many of these Xenos from the Galactic Union, the first thing they saw of a human was these massive mechanical forms, and they would scream out, "Oh, robot, 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 android," or something along those lines in their own verbiage. It wasn't long before they realized this giant bipedal creature was actually trying to give them aid. It didn't matter if it was putting some sort of helmet on them so they could breathe, treating their wounds, carrying those that were unable to stand to another ship to be treated. Every single one of these battlefield angels, even though they had lost their brethren in the first battle, were still willing to go onto ships that may or may not be stable, that may or may not explode at any time as their reactors were beginning to fail. They still would go in and save the creatures of the Galactic Union, those that were willing to surrender. Though there was at least 2 ships, and thankfully only 2, that feigned surrender. And as the recovery ship came close, one of which that docked into its hull, the ship exploded. I guess they're a little bit more human than we thought, as that was a Xeno version of fuck you. The rest of them, however, decided that death was not the answer this day. They ended up being surprised that they were treated humanely. This was a word they didn't understand, but they would learn very quickly as the fleet began to capture tens upon thousands of Xenos. More than 3 dozen different species, many of which were so small they barely counted as actual species, only the size of maybe a cellular phone, and yet they were able to carry speech, and they were able to pilot their ships. Others long and gangly, almost tentacle-like or squid-like as their movements. Each one just happy to still be breathing. Each one expecting to be put in bondage as soon as their wounds healed. Each one expecting to be sold to the highest bidder. And each one surprised when they were told, "That's not how we do things." But each one was still surprised when they found out that they were not leaving the human fleet. They were with the human fleet all the way to the home of the Galactic Council. It would be approximately 6 days before the fleet was underway, as they had to send their own damaged ships back into the dead zone to be repaired. This still left over 10 different battle groups, along with their associated dreadnoughts, ready to fly to the center of the Galactic Union. This time, the message they're going to send isn't going to be human slang or ambiguous in any way. They're going to make sure the message is nice and clear. While the human fleet recovered from the battle, sending some of its ships back for refit and repair, rearming themselves, and of course recovering the lost Xenos, those that they could actually save, they decided it was a good time to get a hold of the hard drives, or at least what counts as a hard drive, in the Xeno fleets. They began to comb through it as fast as they could, since they knew it was possible there was another group of Xenos heading their way, and if they weren't ready for the onslaught, they might not have as good of an outcome. It wasn't long before they discovered the star charts that led to the entirety of the greater Galactic Union. It was amazing how far it stretched. When they color coded it to decide who had what space, it was amazing the amount that was covered by the Galactic Union. But oddly enough, which ones were controlled by the individual Xenos, well, that map changed completely. As it turns out, the humans were right. The tributes was just a way of gaining more and more control over time. And eventually, each Xeno species would be relegated to its own homeworld and possibly a couple of its satellites. If they were lucky, their own galaxy. And then the rest, even though they had colonized it, even though they had terraformed it, it would become the property of the Galactic Union. More often than not, strip mined for its resources and sent back to the center. The center was what the Galactic Union called the collection point for both species that controlled the Galactic Union. It was originally three, but they had deposed the third and taken its own lands, its own planets, its own space for their own. This was something humans understood very well. They didn't like it, even though they understood it. As they reached out to the stars and began to push out, they realized that there might be a better way. They sent a message to the Galactic Center. We are coming. We are coming to sue for peace. Peace is what we desire. However, do not run. If you run, we will chase you across the entire Galactic Union and we will pay no mind to the casualties. We will destroy entire star system. What you have seen of our ships is not our entire arsenal. Weapons that we have will end entire galaxies, though we would prefer not to have to use them. Do not run. We are coming to you. That was what they sent to the Galactic Center. However, to the individual Xenos, they sent a different message altogether. They told them to break free of the Galactic Union. If they declare themselves free of the Galactic Union, break away entirely, and allow safe passage of human ships through their territories, they will not be engaged, and their own people will be returned as safe as possible. This, of course, was met with confusion for most Xenos, as they understood with war that once your group lost, those who fought and were captured alive became slaves, servants, indentured to those who had defeated them. This was their idea of the right of conquest. The humans seemed to have a different idea altogether. As the humans made the first few jumps towards the galactic center, they once again repeated their words to those who were in charge of the Galactic Union. We know who is in charge, and we know where your home planets are. Do not make us have to hunt you down. We will be at your planet in the time frame listed above. Do not run. If you run, you will simply escalate this conflict and bring billions, if not trillions, of innocent lives to an end. That is, unless you care nothing for those that you supposedly rule over. If that is the case, then by all means, run like the scared little bitches you are. Run with your tail between your legs, and we will simply hunt you down. Or you can have the courage to face us. Your choice. It was not long at all before members of the Galactic Union Council, those in charge of them, decided that they would want their own lives saved, and they demanded that others go and fight for them. And it was not long before species after species, 1, 2, 3, 4 at a time, denounced their membership in the Galactic Council. They declared their territories to reach at the borders they had prior to the Galactic Council. One or two might have grabbed a galaxy or two extra, but of course, there was plenty of space. The Galactic Council, of course, demanded that they remain and they fight for those that were in charge. However, The light had been shown that those in charge did not care for the other supporting Xeno groups. It didn't matter to them. As far as they were concerned, they were beneath them in technology, status, and pretty much everything else. By the time the humans had actually gotten within one jump of the Galactic Council planet, it was obvious that the Council itself was merely a shadow of what it once was. Those that remained simply shook at the idea of the human fleet jumping to their planet. However, they were ready for the final assault. At least they believed so. Orbital defense systems were brought online. The remainder of the fleet was ready with weapons primed, the best they had to remain. However, this was to say they might have been the best they had, but their numbers were less than 20% of the original battle. They knew this was a losing battle, yet they sent their own people up there to act as meat shields to the approaching human fleet. And when the humans arrived, things got very sporting very quickly. The human fleet did not even attempt to hide its numbers this time, as they knew that the Xenos understood the mass that was coming their way. However, they did jump in at the very edge of the solar system, which would take them approximately 8 days to reach the fourth planet from their star. This was where the Council was, with all their ships and their satellites sitting there waiting. As the humans approached, they sent out a message on repeat. To those forces in our way, stand down, and you will be able to return to your families. Fire on us, and you will not see the end of this day. The message again repeated, again and again and again. And as the humans began to approach, they got within the orbital path of the fifth planet. They saw something they did not expect. Dozens of the Xeno ships began to break formation, and as soon as they cleared the gravity well, jumped away. This confused them, at least for a moment, until several of the ships that tried to break formation were fired upon by their own orbital defense satellites. These Xenos were running. They were running for their lives because they realized this was a loser's gambit. No one should be told to ever sacrifice themselves for nothing. They realized that the leadership had sent them up there just to be cannon fodder. For what? For nothing. And they realized this. The final ships began to break formation and run as the defense satellites began to fire randomly into ships. As they saw the ships break apart, the Admiral ordered that all human ships to flank speed and to take out those orbital satellites as fast as possible. Save as many of the retreating forces as they could, and they did just that. From impossible ranges, the railguns and torpedoes were fired. It may have taken several minutes for those projectiles to hit their target, but they hit with unbridled precision. Locking on to each one, the human fleet continued. They waited to fire on any of the ships unless those ships actually locked weapons onto them. This amazed the Xenos. How could a species so absolutely violent have the patience, have the honor to hold fire as those who did not want to fight cleared the field? More and more ships saw this, and they must have realized as they began to break away and became under fire by their own ships. There were still zealots, of course, those who would hold the line no matter what, and they began to fire on their own brethren, firing entire broadside volleys of their energy weapons into their allied ships, and the humans watched in horror as these ships were punctured through by those heat rays that they used. Each one would melt through from one side to the other. They didn't even seem to care that their own friendly ships were on the other side. Friendly fire was constant as the humans continued at their best speed. It was at this point those on the ground from the Galactic Union, those screaming orders into their headsets as they tried to get their fleet under control, saw something they did not explain. Massive amounts of small ships launched from the human fleet and were traveling much, much faster than their massive dreadnoughts. What ships were these? Looking through the optics sent back from the orbital satellites, these same ships had that same red marking. They realized at that moment what these were. These were recovery craft. These were the ones that the humans had sent out to their own ships to recover their brethren from the battle. These were not ships designed to destroy. These were ships and crewed by those that were there to save. However, that didn't matter. They believed that if they did not stop the humans here, they didn't have a choice of surviving. It was at that moment one of the orbital satellites traversed itself and lined up for a shot at one of the medical frigates. That is when the humans seemed to lose absolute control. Every weapon that could be fired at that moment fired into the surface of the planet, straight through that orbital satellite and whatever ships were guarding it. It didn't matter. They fired wildly, trying to knock the satellite out of commission before it fired. And they succeeded. That satellite, when it did fire, fired wildly as it tumbled down to the surface, followed by several of the alien ships as they lost complete control and ran for their own life pods. Many, many life pods were seen on the sensors just launching out of the ships in any different direction. Some even launched back into space. And those ships with that red marking aligned themselves up to catch them. The leaders of the Galactic Union now stood just amazed as projectiles that did not hit their target as they were rush shots plummeted into their planet, along with any type of torpedo, missile, or anything that ranged that far. Half a continent was destroyed in a matter of 2 minutes and 4 seconds. It was the equivalent of a supervolcano exploding. The Xenos had never seen devastation on this scale before. It just amazed them. Even their own energy weapons, when they fired on a colony, were not able to do this type of devastation, as the beams must have been focused to do their damage. It was immediately set out that they surrender unconditionally, as they realized that the humans could just easily crack the planet in half if they chose. The alien fleet immediately stood down, with the exception of a half a dozen zealots who rushed towards the human lines, trying to take out those medical frigates. However, they did not get very far. What they had not seen as the carrier had already launched its drones, and they were overtaking the medical frigate as they were far faster than anything that was in the fleet. They got within range of the enemy zealots, and they tore them to pieces. Small parts of the hull would flake off, venting atmosphere. Several bodies or body parts would fly out. The drones would launch their small rockets as soon as they realized that the enemy shields were down. The rockets would penetrate the hull and explode inside, some hitting the reactor core, and a massive explosion, which was akin to a huge firework, would fill up the sky. The battle was over. The human fleet rested over the planet as they sent down shuttles to take care of the wounded and to send emissaries to the Galactic Council. The Galactic Council was shaking in fear as these bipedal creatures that barely stood 2/3 of their own height looked at them with sheer disdain, yet spoke through a translator in Galactic Common calmly. All of these humans standing in their dress uniforms with all their shiny medals and ribbons upon them simply stood there as the one in charge stepped forward. With obvious fear in his voice, the one in charge of the Galactic Union shook as he bowed his head down in submission and stated how he hopes that his slave master, whoever it might be, treats him well. The humans suddenly raised their heads, yet looking straight forward, began to look around to each other. What the fuck is he talking about? The commanding admiral simply looked at this Xeno and said, I'm sorry, we're not here to take slaves. Under the possible realization that he may be executed immediately, the Xeno in charge shit himself. After the highest members of the former Galactic Union had thoroughly embarrassed themselves by crapping their pants, well, that's if they wore pants, the humans took them aside and calmly explained that they were neither there to enslave them or to genocide them. As one human said, if we wanted you dead, we wouldn't be talking. Now, would we? This seemed to calm the former Galactic Union members down, and the humans then started to present their plan to bring peace to the galaxy, at least for a while. It was decided that each of the sentient species' territory lines would be redrawn, and those sentient species that were currently there would have approximately 2 solar rotations, as in 2 years, to remove themselves and any equipment they might have. After those 2 years, they can be considered invaders. However, there is not to be any attack brought out on any neighboring species. Trade is more than welcome. It is encouraged by all means. However, every single sentient species that signs is under an entire decade's worth of obligation to keep their military forces out of each other's space. Incursions will be dealt with by the Terran military. That alone was enough to guarantee that those of the weaker races could breathe a little easier and make those of the stronger races exceptionally hesitant to try anything stupid. As for the humans, they said they would leave the Galactic Union, or should I say, former Galactic Union's territory, as there was no Galactic Union anymore, just simple sentient species deciding what they were going to do with their territory and how they were trading with other sentient species in other territories. This new conglomeration or confederation or whatever the hell you want to call it would work as well as any other, as everyone knows it will only work for a certain amount of time. However, the humans would no longer interfere after that 10-year limit. What they did ask for was minuscule compared to what they could have taken by force. The humans took 15 planets. 15 planets out of well over 3,000 different planets already categorized. Now, these were not all 15 planets. Some of them were moons. However, each of them, the humans said they could terraform if need be. But each of them, if you looked on the star maps, surrounded the dead zone. Each of these would become a human outpost to watch out for any type of incursion heading towards the dead zone. It would also monitor any sort of combat that may happen in the 10-year grace period. This is something that many, many species cheered. The idea that they would be able to count on their new allies. But it was made clear humanity would no longer align themselves directly with any other specific sentient species. There was a chance for that when the Galactic Union still stood. However, because they decided to go in and bring war to humans, humans are no longer interested in it. The humans use those 15 planets as simple relay stations to let the humans in the dead zone know what's going on. However, the size of the dead zone is more than enough for humans to spread out their different cultures and different intelligence, different ways of life for millennia and never enter Galactic Union territory. This put everyone at ease. And as each of those 15 planets was terraformed, they all ended up resembling, similar, a certain planet that was believed to be in the dead zone. It is still questioned where the humans' home planet is and if it could even be possible to even reach their planet before their fleet decided to remobilize and tear you to pieces. Could it be possible to fire any device into their sun to maybe take them out so they wouldn't be a threat? But as of now, as the humans retreat slowly back into the dead zone, the universe holds its breath. Humans are the most dangerous creatures to ever walk, crawl, swim, fly, or take to the stars. And the universe knows it now. If there is any one universal law that has come out, it reads as such: don't fuck with the humans, because they'll fuck you right back, and they'll make it hurt.